Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite you to connect with us on social media and to use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays to tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, which we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself using the chat box at the bottom of the screen and to post any questions you may have in the Q&A box, as we'll be dedicating some time to respond to those questions. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording, as well as any slides and resources shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all of you. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And also, before we start, I'd like to call your attention to our upcoming learning and engagement opportunities. With the holidays coming up, we are excited to share rebroadcasts of some of our most popular and impactful recent sessions over the next 3 weeks. On December 20th, tune in for a rebroadcast of our recent session with Peggy Carr of the National Center for Education Statistics and other leaders, where we take a look behind and beyond the numbers of the latest NAEP scores. Then on the 27th, pick back up on our session from earlier this year that examined stabilizing the early care and education workforce by increasing compensation ASAP. On January 3rd, join us to revisit a hot topic in our rebroadcast of our session titled Easier Said Than Done, Advancing the Science of Reading as the New Normal. And in the coming weeks, be on the lookout for our announcements of our early 2023 lineup of new and inspiring topics and speakers. We'll be sure to add a link in the chat box for more information and registration for these opportunities. Joining you now is Emily Samos, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and hello, everybody. We are so grateful to have you here with us for today's webinar. Which is, give me one sec, sorry. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. Welcome and to each and every one of you. Thank you for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesday webinar, which is titled Follow the Money, 190 billion to Confront Challenges and Seize Opportunities. And we are super excited for today's discussion on such an important topic in what is our last live learning and engagement opportunity of 2022 before we revisit a few past stellar sessions, as Sierra mentioned, over the next few weeks, and then launch into our 2023 lineup. And so today we have the chance to look back and look ahead at ESSER investments as we engage with an incredible panel of experts who will help us follow the money. And so as you all remember, back in early 2021, in the height of the pandemic, when schools were grappling with so much disrupted class time and determining if and when students could return, there was this incredible influx of federal funding support called the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER, as everybody calls it, that was designed to address the unprecedented setbacks and provide a proverbial sigh of relief to a significantly distressed public school system. And that this is also reflective of our ongoing series that has been focused on the Learning Loss Recovery Challenge. And so this multi-billion dollar allocation came with a timestamp, since it is specifically focused on pandemic relief. And at the end of 2022, we are now at the halfway point of the spending window. With such a large sum of money, there's much attention and pressure to invest wisely, and recent headlines are causing alarm, with the Washington Post and others claiming that the federal funding is going unspent by many school districts. So we really need to better understand what these headlines mean, where the estimates are coming from, and really follow the money to take stock of these ESSER investments made to date, how they are balanced between improving school properties and advancing equitable learning recovery, and most importantly, what challenges might be preventing some districts from making smart investments. Unpacking what has happened so far will help us to illuminate a path forward to ensure that investments are made for the greatest impact over the next 2 years. And today we have the opportunity again to do just that, follow the money and unpack what it all means. Our esteemed colleague from the Overdeck Family Foundation, Anu Malpaltal, will moderate a discussion among our panel of experts who will first ground us in the funds that constitute ESSER, like just understanding like what were all these funds, how were they designated, and then share clear data showing what we know about state and district plans for spending, obstacles that have prevented or delayed their investments, and what we know about actual spending to date, and then engage in this discussion about what all the charts and graphs mean for students, for teachers, for school systems. And then we're also going to begin to take a look at smart investments that are proving to have an impact on equitable learning recovery. And CGLR will revisit these smart investments in a follow-up session in January, where we're really going to dig deep into like, what do these smart investments look like? How do we know that they're having an impact? And get everybody's kind of insights on that. And so to begin our conversation, I'm honored to welcome and briefly introduce our esteemed moderator and our presenters with us today. And please note that full bios have been linked in the chat already. So I'm just going to do a quick preview of who we have with us today. So first we have our wonderful moderator, Anu Malpaltal, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. I know you told me, but apologies for that. Anyway, she is Vice President of Education at the Overdeck Family Foundation, where she is a founding team member and brings with her deep background in education leadership and administration. And we're just thrilled to have her lead our discussion today with our expert panel. We also have Marissa Alberti, who supports the national and state partnerships team at the Education Trust in building and supporting coalitions and partner communities that advocate for equity at the national, state, and district levels. And she is jumping in today for Nicholas Munyon-Penny, who's Assistant Director of P12 Policy, who was supposed to be with us, but unfortunately is out sick. We also have David Ardrey, who will be named President of the National Rural Education Association on January 1st, is serving as the 116th president. And he's also in his 10th year as Executive Director of the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools. Emma Dorn is a senior knowledge expert at McKinsey & Company, where she leads knowledge development and dissemination for their education work around the globe. And we are grateful that she has been a repeat presenter, sharing her immense expertise in our GLR Learning Tuesdays. We also have Austin Estes. He's a program director of CCSSO's, that's the Council of Chief State School Officers, COVID Relief Data Project, where he leads a nationwide initiative to study and tell the story of how states are using their 10% elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund reserve, so the set aside. So you will hear all about that, and I'm really glad that he's here with us today to share components of that story. We also have Phyllis Jordan. Has also been a big contributor to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading over the years in her previous roles, and we're super excited to welcome her back in her role as Associate Director of Future Ed, where she writes extensively about education policy with a focus on student absenteeism and of course, COVID relief spending. So welcome to all of you. We look forward to engaging with and learning from you today. And I'm now excited to turn over to Anu to get our conversation and start our journey to follow the money today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Emily, for that intro. So, okay, everybody, we are about halfway into the ESSER timeframe, and it's critical that we follow the money, as Emily said, to understand what's been happening with the $190 billion of recovery funding. And just as a recap, in order to spend ESSER dollars, districts were required to develop and submit spending plans. Now that we're 2 years in, we have the data to show what has been planned versus what has been spent. As we follow the funding today, you'll see several presentations that are data heavy. We're hearing from experts with different vantage points, so I hope you'll take it all in. And just a quick few reflections from me on my role from a philanthropic vantage point. At Overdeck Family Foundation, we fund organizations in early childhood, out of school time, and across the K-9 spectrum. All of these areas have been impacted by COVID, and many of them work with districts that have been able to secure additional funds to support with recovery. So a few reflections before I turn it over to our panel. The challenges that we've been seeing in schools and the broader system today aren't just a result of COVID, but because of COVID, for the first time, schools have access to unprecedented amounts of funding. We have the opportunity to ensure that funding is used to address both immediate needs while also thinking about what can be done differently going forward. For the immediate needs, we have tons of data that show that kids need both remediation and acceleration, and that need is urgent, whether it's tutoring, summer and after school time. There are many evidence-based options. And also we can think about how to use the money to reimagine the classroom for the future. We can build towards a better future, one that's innovative, effective, and scalable, while also being sustainable. So this could look like thinking through one teacher, one classroom, the one teacher, one classroom model, adding personalized learning tracks, giving kids more transparency and agency through formative assessments, rethinking the parent role as another teacher. There's a lot of options here. But as a funder, we're seeing that most of the organizations that we support are spending, but they're not spending quickly enough for the most part. They're worried about the cliff on the horizon, and they're worried about what it means for the personnel that they've brought in. And they're also feeling this tension between how to serve the urgent needs while also planning. Enough from me, let's turn it to the experts. So Phyllis, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here. Hi Phyllis, tell us about the work that you do with Future Ed to follow the money, and start from the beginning. Reminder of how much money was directed towards education and the COVID relief funds, and what districts put in their original ESSER spending plans, and sort of showing us how they intended to invest. I know you also have some interesting data comparing how rural, urban, suburban districts plan to spend on academic recovery. So we'd love to see that as well.
Sure. Thanks so much, Anu. Future Ed is a think tank at Georgetown University. And about a year ago, we worked with Burbia, which is a commercial firm that's tracking what's in every local spending plan. That's where we get the data. Let me start first with where the money's coming from. You all probably know this, but starting in March 2020, Congress put $13.2 billion for K-12 schools. The next COVID relief plan put $54 billion, and the American Rescue Plan put $122 billion. There are other bits of money, like money for special ed, money for homeless, but this is, as Emily described, the ESSER fund that's basically for emergency relief and academic recovery. Next slide. To give you a sense of the proportion of this money, I mean, if you look at the second dot, that's what our school districts typically get in Title I money. Look how much bigger the second round of funding is, and then the American Rescue Plan is just huge in terms, almost 4 times what districts are typically getting in Title I. And because the money flows through the Title I formula, the districts with the most need are generally getting the most money, which is a good thing. So looking at plans, we looked at, next slide, we looked at about 5,000 school district plans, some charter schools in there too. And what we found was, we read a lot of stories about, it's all going for athletic facilities. But what we found is most of it's going for stuff that matters for learning. Thank you. The staffing takes more than a quarter of the funding. I had a reporter call me the other day and say, why are people spending on teachers and not on academic recovery? Which prompted me to remember what a researcher told me. What does academic recovery really look like without teachers? I mean, you really need staffing to deliver the instruction kids need. And some of this goes for things like bonuses, but a lot of it is going for extra teachers to reduce class sizes, academic coaches. For a lot, 40% of districts are spending on professional development to get teachers more training in things like literacy and math instruction. So there's a lot of this staffing component goes into academic recovery. Then a quarter goes for academic recovery initiatives like summer learning, tutoring, after school. We see a lot of people buying instructional materials, buying all new curriculum, they're buying new instructional software. And then about a third goes for facilities. A lot of this is for HVAC, for heating and air conditioning and ventilation, partly because COVID is an airborne disease, but partly because a lot of districts have a lot of needs in that area. And eventually good facilities can lead to better learning. And so altogether, about 3/4 of the money is going for these priorities. We're also seeing the pink slide is technology and the yellow one is mental and physical health. So next slide. We looked, in addition to how much money is being spent, we looked at what were the most popular priorities for spending. And teachers and interventionists came in #1 in every region of the country, in every poverty district. HVAC was very large. Summer learning, really popular, probably even more popular than this because some districts lumped their summer learning money in with their after school. So that figure is probably even higher. So, but you can see here also toward the bottom, the mental health providers and SEL, there's a real focus on getting kids the mental health support they need. Next slide. And we broke this data down in different ways. We also have an analysis that looks at poverty rates and one that looks at partisan lean. But one of the things we looked at was our rural and urban school districts spending in different ways. We found some differences in terms of urban, city and suburban schools spending more likely to spend on summer learning and after school, perhaps because of the transportation challenges that rural places face in getting kids to these programs. We also found rural places more likely to spend on instructional materials. Tutoring was about the same, assessments about the same, but we see some differences there. The difference were even more stark when you looked at things like social emotional learning and hiring psychologists, which rural districts were less likely to do. Next slide.
Thanks, Phil. So tell us about these broad numbers. What does your research tell us about what amount that has been invested so far and what some of the trends are we're seeing in those investments?
Right. And we did this 5,000 district analysis, and now we're pivoting to actual spending. And it doesn't always line up the way you think. For instance, a plan will say we're spending on teachers and after-school providers and tutors and summer learning people, and the portal for spending comes out and it says salaries. So you can't always make a one-to-one correlation, but we've been looking at what's the pace of spending. So can you click through again? Yeah, so the total allotted is almost 190 billion, and click again. We see that the first round has almost all been spent. It was supposed to be obligated to a contract, spent or obligated to some sort of contract by September. And most of this data is as of August. This is the latest that the federal government has put out. So most of that has been spent. More than half of the second round has been spent. The big issue is the third round, which is the biggest. But if you look at that total, 67.5 billion, that's about a third of the money. It's also more than 4 times what districts spend in yearly in their Title I funding. So while it's not enough, it's a lot of money. It's hard to say they're sitting on their money when they have spent this much money in basically 2 years. There's 2 more years to go. They've got to pick up the pace, but we feel like we are seeing a faster pace, and we are seeing district spending. And we're at the same time, we see some districts and some states that aren't spending as much. I think there needs to be some attention to that. Next slide. That might be it for my slides. Oh, wait, let me talk about some promising trends we've seen. One of the things I mentioned is there's a lot of professional development, teacher training in the science of reading, the letters training, if you know that program, or just training in how to teach kids to decode, use phonics, phonemic awareness, all those things. This is really a good, this has suddenly come back in the news at a time when we have a lot of money to spend on it. So we're seeing a lot going there. And we're seeing a lot of money towards summer learning and after school, and a renewed attention to chronic absenteeism, because as you probably have read, absenteeism has been really bad between illness and mental health issues, and there's a real strong effort to re-engage kids. Tutoring, which is a great solution, but often done just sporadically. There's some real systemic approaches to putting that by states and districts that can expand capacity. And people are finally recognizing that social emotional well-being is really important to academic success and putting money toward that. And finally, we see states and districts are paying attention to what works. I was just reading today about the city of St. Paul that has initiated a program where they're putting a lot of reading coaches, and they've already got evidence that it's working. The state of Connecticut and also North Carolina are both have put money toward programs, and then they are tracking how they are working and making adjustments when they see what works. So these are all really promising trends in the way people are starting to spend their money. So
super helpful overview, Phyllis. We will be coming back to this later in the discussion, so appreciate the overview. I will invite Austin to hop on the screen. You're ready. Hey, Austin. Would love for you to review what we know about state spending, specifically with the allowance that state education agencies can reserve up to 10% of the ESSER funds at the state level. Tell us about what you've learned about how states are using these funds.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this incredible session and for inviting me and CCSSO to join today. My name, again, is Austin Estes. I'm the program director of the COVID Relief Data Project with CCSSO. And as was mentioned before, the ESSER program is an unprecedented level of funding that the federal government is providing for K-12 education. We're talking $190 billion overall that was offered through 3 tranches of funding, each with their own different timelines for spending funds. So it's an incredible amount of money. And the program was designed such that state education agencies could reserve 10% of the total allocation for use by the state education agency in implementing statewide priorities for pandemic recovery. So even though 90% of the money is allocated directly to districts, 10% still amounts to about $19 billion overall across states, which is quite a bit more money than federal money than state education agencies typically work with. So there's an opportunity here for a lot of innovation and supports and initiatives led by state education agencies to support the recovery. So with the COVID Relief Data Project, we've been working to track down information from states about how those funds are being used. And in partnership with ESSER leads in each of the state education agencies, we've been able to build a pretty comprehensive database that gives us a really clear picture of how those funds are being used. Next slide, please. So the first step in our project was first to clarify the questions that we wanted to answer through our research. So we wanted to specifically know whether states or what states were prioritizing in using their ESSER funds and whether they were on track to use those funds within the program period. And there's a number of different metrics that we could look at. So we could look at state and local plans, which tell us the intentions and priorities for using those funds. But as we all know, plans can change. We could also look at commitments and obligations. So these essentially are, we're talking about obligations, we're talking about legal commitments that state education agencies or local education agencies are making with a vendor or a contractor to spend down funds for a specific purpose. So that's really what we're trying to look at with our analysis is state level commitments. In addition to obligations, we're also tracking sub-grants. So the money that has been awarded by the state to nonprofits, to local school districts, et cetera, for supporting COVID recovery efforts. And one way to think about commitments, it's like if you're making a payment or taking out a loan to purchase a car, you're probably not going to pay for the full cost of the car up front, but you'll be making monthly payments and you've made an obligation to pay the full amount of that car over time. So we're looking at the car. We want to know what are states buying with their ESSER funds over the course of the implementation period. And then the third data point that you could look at is the money that's actually spent. So how much money has been drawn down, has gone out the door, has been, how many dollars have been spent. And as Phyllis was talking about earlier, the U.S. Department of Education is reporting information on dollars spent through the Education Stabilization Fund dashboard. However, this data is lagged due to reimbursement and reporting timelines. So it gives us a snapshot in time but oftentimes is a little bit of a look backwards instead of a look forwards at intentions to spend funds. So next slide. In our project, the COVID Relief Data Project, we're looking at state level commitments. And we've seen that about 3/4 of the state reserve funds have been committed through obligations, including contracts with vendors and service providers, as well as subgrants to districts and other entities. So that's the majority of the funds have already been committed to those purposes. Of the remaining funds, most of those have been budgeted. So for example, a state might have set aside money for summer enrichment programming in 2024, but maybe those grants haven't been awarded yet because they're going through the competition right now to make those awards. So overall, if we're looking at each of the 3 different ESSER programs, the ESSER 1 funds have virtually all been committed. As Phyllis was mentioning earlier, we're seeing that reflected at the local level as well. With ESSER 2, 80% of those funds have been committed. And then with ESSER 3, it's about 2/3 of the funds. Next slide, please. And this data gives us an opportunity to look across states and understand what state education agencies are prioritizing as part of their pandemic recovery efforts. And the main finding is that states are laser focused on academic recovery initiatives using their state reserve funds. We've seen close to $4.2 billion dedicated towards tutoring and accelerated learning opportunities, almost $3 billion towards out of school time programs, including summer school, before and after school programs, and initiatives to extend the school year or the school day. There's also an investment in high quality curriculum and instruction, in high quality remote learning opportunities, and other academic recovery priorities. But I do also want to note, as Phyllis was mentioning earlier, there are other priorities that states are working to address through their recovery efforts, including efforts to recruit and retain school personnel, including not just educators, but also bus drivers and other critical employees in the school building. And then we're seeing a focus on student and staff well-being, supports for physical and mental health, supports for social emotional learning, and in other types of investments. Next slide. I'd encourage you to check out more information on our website at ccsso.org/ESSER funds. We include more details about each of these categories of investment along with state examples. And please stay tuned in the future for more information and resources from CCSSO. And I'll hand it back to you, Anu.
Thanks, Austin. It is quite encouraging to look at this data and see that states, how much states have already committed and what's planned. So I appreciate the overview, and I know we'll come back to you a little bit later in the conversation. I appreciate that. Okay, Emma, I would love to invite you into the conversation. I know you all recently conducted a study at McKinsey of district leaders. I'm going to ask you a 3-part question, which I know is all addressed in your presentation. But first, I'd love to hear you share more about how districts' actual spending compares to what we heard from Phyllis about their spending plans. Second, I'd love to hear you talk more about some of the major obstacles that districts are facing in spending these funds, what's really preventing the deployment of the funds. And then thirdly, would love to know about sort of how the funds were spent, but also what we expect or predict the funds to be invested in moving forward.
Just finding the unmute button. Great to be here. Thank you so much. And happy to share a little bit around the other side of that coin, which is how districts are spending the money. As Austin said, about 10% of the ESSER funds going to that state set aside, and then 90% going directly to districts. I think as we've been talking with districts across the country and working with districts, it's been an incredibly difficult couple of years, and districts have had so many different things thrown at them. And districts are struggling to spend some of this ESSER funds effectively, given the kind of one-time nature of the funds, given the short time frame, given the labor market and given some of the other challenges kind of facing them. So we wanted to dig into this a little bit more, understand how much of the money was being spent by districts, what was the pace of spend, and then what were some of the challenges that districts are facing. So we did a survey of 260 district administrators, pretty representative across the country. There were some urban, some rural, some large districts, some small districts, some majority free and reduced lunch districts, and some wealthier districts, really a mix. And some real common threads coming across those that would love to share with you all. So maybe if we pop to the next page, this at a high level was what we heard from districts around the major challenges that they were facing in spending stimulus funds. And we basically only allowed districts to choose 3 challenges. So their top 3 challenges in spending funds. And you can see that 93% overall of education leaders were experiencing some difficulty in actually getting money out the door. There were kind of 3 overall categories of challenges. And so the first would be administrative hurdles. And so this is things like reporting and compliance, especially early on. I think a lot of districts are trying to work out how do they actually spend this money effectively and comply with all the reporting requirements. Anytime there's something new, there's a bit of getting up to speed. There was also initially some delays in receiving funds. And I think those 2 are probably, this survey was done in about May of this year. And so as we're talking to district leaders, those are becoming less critical. I think one that we're continuing to hear on the administrative side, really at the forefront is procurement. Just getting the support from the procurement teams to be able to spend this amount of money in a short period of time in a way that really helps to accelerate learning, student learning outcomes. I think the second group of challenges that we've heard districts talk about a lot is just the availability of talent and vendors. We're in a very tight labor market. All districts are trying to hire for the same positions all at once. And so we've worked with districts who are trying to get a social worker in every school, or districts who are trying to increase the number of teachers for intervention, or districts who are trying to ramp up tutoring. And in all of those cases, that just finding challenges that everyone is going after the same staff and really having challenges in filling those open positions. I think the third category then that we see is just internal planning capacity. Districts have been incredibly busy. Often they don't have the setup or orchestrating teams to organize this kind of multi-year planning and budgeting, or to balance some of the competing priorities. And all of this in the context that ESSER funds must be obligated by this September 2024 deadline. And so the one-time nature of those funds and the coming fiscal cliff is on district leaders' minds. And so we then asked districts, to what extent have you managed, and this, remember, was of May this year, to what extent have you managed to spend the money so far, budgeted the money, and to what extent do you think there may be some money you just won't be able to budget or use given the deadline? And if you go to the next page, what we found is, and just so that you can kind of navigate to the page, vertically here are the 3 different ESSER, funding cycles, ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3. And then the SEA reserve, that 10% is taken out. So of the district money then, they've spent about 23% of total ESSER funds. That's about 26% of the district portion. They've budgeted a further 33%, but there's a chunk here that hasn't been budgeted. And in fact, almost $20 billion may be at risk of not being spent at all. And this is directly from survey data when we asked district administrators what they thought the reality looked like going forwards. Now that number varies considerably by state. We didn't have enough respondents to cut the data with statistical significance by state. So if you go to the next page, we looked at the Education Stabilization Fund Transparency Portal to get a sense of the amount of funding, the amount of the ESSER funding that have been spent by state. And a bit of a caveat here, similar to what Austin said, the spending data on this portal lags actual spending given that the funds are provided on a reimbursement basis. But the state comparisons should be mostly valid. And so you can see that there's some really big differences where some states about halfway through ESSER, some states have spent about half of funds, around 55%. That would be some of these darker blue states, whereas others have spent under a quarter and as low as 16%. The final piece of the question that Anu asked that I'd love to address is what are districts spending on and how is that changing? And so we asked actually districts, not the total amount of spending, which was the question that Phyllis was asking, which I think is a really important question, but the trends. What are people spending more on? And what are they planning to spend more on in the future? And what are they spending less on and planning to spend less on in the future? And if we hop to the next page, we can kind of see the results of that. On the x-axis here is the growth in spending between 2019 and 2022. So this is kind of a little bit of a backwards looking perspective. And then on the y-axis here, projected growth of spending from now to 2020-25. And so if you just look at what people spent on mostly in the 19 to 2022, substitute compensation, teacher recruitment, HVAC, student devices at the top of the list. Obviously the labor shortages causing a high amounts of growth in substitute comp, a big amount of growth on HVAC and ventilation, and then student devices as students went hybrid. If you look going forwards, those numbers are a little different, and what people expect to spend most on, substitute comp is still up there, but teacher training and professional development going higher up. Tutoring right at the top of the list, didn't see as much growth as perhaps folks had expected, but a lot of districts planning to spend more on that. And then some of the other elements of recovery, credit recovery, and intervention services, but also a lot more on behavioral mental health and special education. And so we kind of categorize these in four different categories. One was these continued learning imperatives. There's been a lot of growth. There's going to continue to be growth. The second is these emerging district priorities, these orange ones, where we're expecting a real acceleration. And I think tutoring, behavioral health there. Worth bearing in mind that these kind of pandemic and baseline priorities, they're still expecting to grow in the next couple of years. And so, yeah, happy to explain the graph again. So and thanks for the comment. So really on the x-axis is how much things grew in the last 3 years. And on the y-axis here is how much things are expected to grow. So you can see substitute compensation is in this continued learning imperatives where it grew really fast in the last 3 years and is expected to grow fast going forwards. Tutoring here in this emerging district priorities didn't grow as fast over the last 5 years, but is expected to grow more quickly going forwards. And then in the bottom here are things that are not expected to grow as quickly going forwards, but still will see some growth. And so those are, maybe some of the core pieces like SASs and LMSs where districts kind of have things in place, don't expect a lot of growth going forwards. Hopefully that was helpful. So happy to talk more as we go into the comments and the panel discussion around what this means going forwards. But this is just a little bit of a reflection of what we were hearing. Yes, the orange and the pink are going to grow faster, and the gray and the blue are going to grow less quickly. So it's not the total amount; it's around growth. But happy to talk more about this and about other things going forwards, and happy to pass back to Anu to get some more perspectives of how this maybe differs in different types of districts.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma. This is super helpful. I feel like we could spend hours just looking at this graph and visual and trying to understand and try to plan for what's coming over the next few years. So thanks for that overview. We'll come back to you later, as you mentioned. But David, I'd love to invite you in here, given that you work with rural districts. And so we've heard from the state perspective, we've heard from the district perspective, and we'd love to just sort of dig a little bit deeper here on the rural experience. And so we heard a bit from Phyllis about the trends and spending plans, and really curious about how these data about spending relate to what's happening with rural districts. Curious to learn more from you about what challenges that you're seeing districts are navigating and what you've seen as smart investments that rural districts are making to make an impact for students and families in rural communities.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. And I was thinking as we were watching the interpreter sign that we needed to stop and just take a breath. There's so much to unpack. And then I realized as I was following a bit of the script that, I was going to be asked to look back on 3 or 4 people's comments and tie that together with rural. So I may glance down. I've made some notes that I think are going to be really critical. If I can ask, I think it's slide 12 that Phyllis used, bar graph, maybe pop that back up. It will help us give some context. Yeah, so the comparisons that, back to the bar graph. There we go. Good. So comparisons of city, suburb, town, and rural, I think, are really critical kind of entry context. And I think what's notable is that across the board, they're fairly comparative. And so in the early stages of spending, that gives me really no cause for concern. But I think in context, what people should understand. So let's take instructional materials. In the early days of many of our rural districts, and I can speak to Illinois specifically, but as well at the national level, while some districts were reaching out and providing devices to students, we had rural districts in their buildings using copying machines and preparing packets and documents. And so I think there's context to what is being used, what we're spending money on in the early stages of this. And so in our rural districts, they're trying to build capacity to get to that more virtual learning, electronic-based education. But the reality of it was there were 2 things happening. One, we were packing lunches and sending buses out with food to kids, because in rural districts, our schools really are the hub of the community and provide a vital resource, really as a warm place to be with a roof over your head and 2.5 meals a day, which is critical. And then, so you lose that, and then your instructional materials really, we just weren't prepared for what was going to happen, and no one's fault. Who knew that we were going to face a pandemic in this country? So I think in context, it's important to know that while the bar graphs represent certain categories, after school tutoring, student assessments, how those apply to rural districts, and especially, and we always talk about there are rural districts and there are really rural districts. And when you get into our really rural districts, these bar graphs will have a different look on the expenditure. So I thought that was important. I also think just comparing it to what the funds will be available in the final stages. So when we get into the American Rescue Plan funds, 168 billion, I don't want to say it was easy, but in the early days of spending these funds, the dollar amounts were lower to try to expend these funds. When we throw that large number and those numbers into small rural districts, just the capacity to manage the expenditures and the ability to have resources to actually purchase. So I'm trying to find HVAC systems, and not only do I have a supply chain issue, but I have a regional and local problem I can't solve because I don't have contractors in my area. I have to reach out and find them 100 miles away. And so I think I'm really looking ahead at this larger number and how that will impact our district.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. We'll come back to you a little bit later to learn more about the experience and some of the challenges. Marissa, I'd love to invite you on. Hi, Marissa. So at EdTrust, I know you all have been examining how district spending plans have focused on equitable learning recovery. And you all recently shared a great report on promising practices. We heard a little bit about, from Phyllis about promising trends, but would love for you to build on this and tell us what you've learned about smart and effective investments that support equitable learning recovery and the examples and communities that you have discovered and that you'd like to highlight for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So many of the questions kind of in the chat and that folks are raising are the same questions we've been asking, is how do we actually know, and how can the Education Trust, who we primarily work with advocates and coalitions of advocates in states and local communities across the country on pushing school districts, pushing states on some of these issues and ensuring that the children and students that have the most needs are receiving these dollars, and that programs being implemented and spending is on evidence-based programs that we know from historical research actually works. And so we put out a few resources for advocates in 2020 and 2021, and we heard, do you all have examples of what this actually looks like? And of course, at first we didn't, because none of us had ever gone through a pandemic before, but we quickly decided to provide a resource that would provide both examples of promising practices of some districts across the country, as well as some key guidelines and guardrails that advocates and practitioners can be asking districts in some equity areas. So next slide. So the 6 areas highlighted in the brief are provided here: targeted intensive tutoring, expanded learning time, student, family, community engagement, safe and equitable learning environments, addressing teacher shortages, and data equity and reporting. So again, in the report, you'll see a list of questions that you can ask district leadership on how they're spending in each of these categories to ensure that they are evidence-based and equitable practices. And so today I'll actually highlight 3 examples from each of these. Next slide. All right, so targeted intensive tutoring. I won't go through all of the indicators and questions, but some key things that we would want to see in spending related to targeted intensive tutoring in districts is that tutoring programs are actually using certified professionals. These can be teachers and paraprofessionals, or it could be trained volunteers, but these folks are certified, they're trained, they receive ongoing professional development. There's small student to teacher ratios, that these tutoring programs occur all year and at least several times a week, and that they target students with the greatest need. We also would want to see that these programs are using data to actually monitor student progress and actually assess the program's effectiveness. Some of the things we want to be aware of with tutoring programs is, again, if schools are using peers or untrained volunteers, they're not using a curriculum that's aligned to student learning objectives, that the program is broad and not actually targeted to students that have the most need, or that these programs don't also complement a quality daily instruction that's happening in the classrooms throughout the day. So in the next slide, you can see that we highlighted Metro Nashville Public Schools, their Accelerating Scholars program in the report. And one thing I'll say is promising practices does not equal perfect. It means that it is a contextual practice that one community has chosen to use, and it doesn't actually meet every single requirement that we have laid out, but it is a practice that we think we can learn from. And we spoke with district leaders in all of these places where we highlighted, and we asked them about key lessons learned. And so we really wanted to know, okay, when you were implementing these practices, what did you actually learn? What did you take away, so that we can take those learnings and amplify them? And so for the Accelerating Scholars program, they only served about 4,000 students. Nashville's a very big district, so they tailored it to a smaller group, multiple times a week, at least 30 minutes, small group of students. They trained tutors, they utilized grade level curriculum. They used an equity metric, so they targeted these programs to the students who needed it most, and then they collected weekly data to be able to understand their progress. And so some of the lessons they learned that from talking to our district partners there were that they purposely scaled down the program and only provided it for a small group of students in order to make sure that it was done to fidelity and that it was being impactful. They also talked about how stakeholder engagement was critical for their success. So working with families, community organizations, and school leaders. Another lesson learned is that this actually was a fiscally feasible program. They, through their work, got the cost down to about $450 per student per semester, which means they're more likely to be able to sustain this beyond the time period, and that it actually takes a lot of planning time, but it's actually worth it. And so thinking about needing to put in the effort on the front end in order to receive the effectiveness that we know tutoring can have. I'll go quickly through the next couple examples. So the next one is student, family, and community engagement. This is a special one in my heart. But again, making sure practices are actually rooted in evidence. What do we know works for family engagement? That family engagement is linked to student learning. It's not just about building connection, it's building connection in service of student success. That these practices are integrated into district plans, and that they're equity focused, solidarity driven, and liberatory. Again, beware of just a one size, a program, and not thinking about the ongoing practice and need to train teachers and educators on family engagement. And then another big beware of is thinking about fixing problems for students and families as opposed to engaging them and collaborating with them as partners. And so the example we highlighted here on the next slide is Alexandria Public Schools, right next door to me in Virginia. And they decided to hire some professionals within the district, some family liaisons, specifically targeted at engaging multilingual families. So they identified some needs specifically through they used data from some family surveys and a district family helpline, and found that families really were wanting certain supports. They needed more language support. And so the district identified that need. They hired within the community. They focused on a evidence-based framework. They did training for staff, and they established some clear metrics for success. Again, some of the big lessons learned: actually ask families and what they want and what they need. That should be their baseline. And then they really took ownership of the district, took ownership of meeting families where they are. So one example is that they found many of their families communicated via WhatsApp. And so the district established a communication system using that same database. And the last example I'll quickly go through is the teacher recruitment and retention. We have a whole lot of research and work in this area, so happy to follow up on this one. But again, look-fors are that districts are focusing not just on recruiting teachers, but they're focused on supporting and retaining educators. That's a huge one. And so it's not, again, on the beware of, it's not about just quickly filling open positions with folks that are not trained and not supported just to fill staffing shortages. Making sure that districts are hiring linguistically and culturally diverse staff. And that, again, everything, as always, is evidence-based, as for example, grow your own programs, which I know some folks in the chat were highlighting some really strong programs there. So the example that I'll highlight here in the next slide is Providence, Rhode Island, and they did some really great targeted hiring incentives. So they really thought about incentives that were very large. So some teaching incentives had up to $13,000 to be teaching in certain schools that had the highest need. They conducted interviews with teachers hired via this program to kind of look back and understand, what worked and what didn't work and how we can implement this in the future. And they used their vacancy data and applicant data to be able to target incentives towards the highest need positions. So lessons learned here: who you hire is important. Again, it's not just about hiring folks, but it's ensuring that there's a fit and that it's about supporting people. Retention is just as important as recruitment, and then hiring strong teachers requires strong hiring practices. So I'll stop there. I know that was a lot, and I'm excited to talk some more about these.
Cool, Marissa, thanks so much. I love that you highlighted these three really important areas that showed up in many of the graphs throughout the earlier presentations. And I love the really common themes between all three of the spotlights, which is a focus on trained personnel, a focus on solutions that are fiscally feasible, which we'll talk about the funding cliff later in this conversation, so that feels very prudent. And then thirdly, a focus on effectiveness, ensuring that what districts are choosing to do is really in service of student and learning outcomes. So appreciate that really beautiful set of highlights. Okay, so you are our last presentation and a highlight, Marissa, so thank you for that. What I'm going to do actually is we'll go off of this, we'll take the slides away, and I would love to invite the full group here for a panel conversation where I have several questions that I would love to just be able to ask the group and for us to build off of one another. Let me see, is everybody here? I think so. Okay, there we go. All righty. So let's start with, we started a part of this conversation, we've touched on the challenges that districts across the country are facing, both allocating and using ESSER funds. Many of you spoke about this in your presentations. I'd love to see if we can elevate or talk about examples where districts have overcome these shared challenges. Emma, you spoke about challenges that are operational, challenges that are sort of talent and labor, or internal planning capacity challenges. So wondering if we could sort of highlight places that are doing this well, understanding sort of what sets them apart. And David, I'd love to hear and maybe start with you, if you know from the rural perspective, as you look across the districts that you're working with, who's doing this well and how are they overcoming the challenges?
Yeah, I think I'll offer you a more broad perspective on this for a couple of reasons. What you'll find with rural districts is that they individually are very unique in their own rights, and their challenges, while they are across the board the same, how they solve those challenges are not even close to the same. So I think what I want to make my comments around are the notion that that really, when the pandemic hit, and then throughout the last 2.5+ years, you saw in rural districts an all hands on deck approach. And that didn't just include teachers or educators, that was administrators, bus drivers, ancillary employees, kitchen staff, the custodians. I mean, truly it was, you're going to be doing work that you've never done before for us to be able to get through a time period. I think more importantly, I thought our rural districts did a good job of spending funds or allocating funds where it would meet the best or most needs that were actually accessible to them. So if you go out and spend, you allocate funds for something that you know you're not going to see in 3 years, those funds really didn't help you at that point. And so rural districts were really forced into a position that spend the money in the best way possible to get resources you need. And then a little bit of close your eyes, state chiefs, and know that we're doing the work the best we can with the lack of resources that we have. And I think lastly, they did a great job of finding partnerships that were available, whether that was through higher ed or community services or whatever that service or organization they could find to help them as a resource. They were using those resources in a very effective way. So if you look across the board, if you point 1 or 2 or 10 of them out, they accomplished the same thing, but they did it very differently. And I think that, I can't leave the comment without saying there are still very significant challenges in our rural communities and schools, and throwing lots of money at them is important, but time might be more important. And we may get to that conversation in a bit, but this notion this is going to come to a cliff or a physical cliff, that cliff was coming, it already exists. So how do we soften or dampen the cliff using the resources, extending time, cognizant of some of the challenges that are out there?
Yeah, super helpful. I think it's so poignant of you, David, to point out that, a big part of this overcoming the challenge is time, is both time and personnel. The funding is not sufficient. So I appreciate you naming that so explicitly. Marissa, I'm actually going to turn to you just to see if You highlighted beautifully a few different districts that were doing really great things. What do you think is setting them apart and allowing them, like how are they overcoming these challenges to be able to sort of implement these really innovative practices?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go kind of going back to some of those lessons learned, kind of hearing from them. A big one that was in 2 of those examples was partnership. So whether that's working with families or community organizations. And, I think partnership can kind of be thrown around as a word, but it really does take time and trust and a built up system. And, I think the districts that have had those systems of strong family and community engagement and partnership from the beginning prior to the pandemic were able to then leverage those. And I think, so thinking about Metro Nashville and Alexandria, they really had an idea and had a frame and knew about evidence-based practices on the front end, and were able to kind of think about, okay, how then can we leverage our families and our communities to support? I would also say data and just taking the time to plan it out. Again, I think with the Metro Nashville example, they couldn't provide their program for every single student, and they had to say no to some students. And that can be a really difficult decision, I think, as a district leader to make. But because they were able to focus in, they could have really quality data. They could look back on what they did and really learn, so that then in the future they could expand to all of their students that needed it. And so I think those 2 things are really front and center for me on what success can look like. And there's still, as David said, there's still a long ways to go, and they're facing a lot of challenges, but those are some of the things that we saw.
Super helpful. I appreciate that, Marissa. Emma, I just want to invite you, anything you'd offer on where you named some of the challenges very explicitly up front. Are you seeing districts that are overcoming these challenges? If so, what is setting them apart?
Sure, maybe I can give an example of one district, but then also maybe some threads that we're seeing kind of across districts as well. So an example of one district that has managed to overcome some of these challenges is Dallas ISD. And one of the things that they did is they had a very intentional process and performance management system for actually thinking about how do we plan, launch, and manage our ESSER initiatives. And so took a step back, launched a really structured cross-departmental process to oversee some of the initiative planning to ensure that they were prioritizing the things that really were addressing some of the greatest student needs, but also put in place some continuous improvement tools so that they could be a little bit agile in shifting that. And some of the things that they've managed to roll out, $75 million to extended school year initiatives to really increase instructional time. They've managed to roll out high quality tutoring for 20,000 students who are behind grade level in reading and math. And that's a real achievement, because in a lot of the districts that we've talked with, they've rolled out high dosage tutoring, but it's hitting 500, 1,000 students. It's still very early pilots. And so being able to do that at scale, I think is really impressive. If I maybe take a step back and say, well, what are some of the things that both Dallas did, but also some of the other districts have done who've managed to spend this money successfully whilst being cognizant of the one-time nature of the funding? And I think it's kind of 3 things. One is working out, how do you make sure that you're intentionally addressing the most urgent COVID-related student needs? And so part of that is the targeting. It's targeting the students that have the highest needs, or the schools that do. Part of it is really thinking about what are the few things around attendance, around learning gaps based on the latest data. For example, bringing in the NAEP data and saying, oh my goodness, we have a real problem in 8th grade math. Let's think about addressing that. And then some of the data around mental health, behavioral health. I think the third under that is really making sure that you're using evidence-based practices shown to accelerate learning. And so not just rolling out any old tutoring, but rolling out some of the high quality tutoring with some of the characteristics that some of our panelists talked about. I think the second thing that's really important to balance with that, and this is where the magic lies, and also where a lot of the remaining challenges are, and there really are no easy answers, is planning for funding sustainability. And so I think the districts that we're seeing who are doing this well are making sure that any new hires or new programs with ongoing funding commitments have some backfill, not like a prayer and a wish backfill, but actually some clear backfill from some longer term funding stream. Also thinking about prioritizing programs which have an upfront setup cost, but then a cost neutral going forwards. So, you know, opportunity culture, for example, we've seen some states look at putting that into place. There's an upfront cost, but it's cost neutral going forwards. Longer term funding streams, especially on the behavioral health, mental health side, are there ways to use the money now to stand up district capabilities so that you can apply for Medicaid reimbursement longer term, and then that can also enable backfill and some other things. I think the third is like contracting with outside providers who can be ramped up and down, so you don't necessarily have everybody on your on your hiring budget and put yourself in a potentially untenable position 2024, 2025. And then just including contingency plannings or around what would you do in different go forward funding scenarios, and thinking about that now versus later. I think the third one, and then I'll pass on to someone else because I know I've been talking a long time, is just building budget flexibility to respond to new data or changing circumstances. I think a lot of districts understandably have kind of this annual planning cycle. And so the districts we've seen who've been able to do this well, both look beyond that cycle to multi-year planning, but also look within that cycle to be able to have some flexibility as new data comes out, to be able to kind of shift where they're focusing on, where data's coming in on what's working, what isn't, to be able to adjust.
Love it. You know what, Emma, this is super helpful overview. I think you touched on many of the same themes that Marissa did as well, with a little bit more context, which I really appreciate. And you're starting to touch on this fiscal cliff concept, which we'll get to in just a minute. But you touched on one thing that I'd like to expand on a bit more, and I'd like to direct a question to Phyllis on, which is this, you brought up the concept of sort of continuous improvement systems to be able to really understand if things are working, and to use that information and data to be able to scale up things that we know are good for kids or working for kids. So Phyllis, I'd be curious if you could share a bit more about your research and what it tells us about whether the investments that have been made in summer and after school programs, if they're paying off, and what you know about how states and districts are trying to track student level outcomes.
Right. Well, I can tell you that there's 2 states I've been really impressed with what they're doing on tracking. One is North Carolina, which is taking some of its ESSER funds and using it to evaluate everything they're doing at a state level and some of the local level projects. If you, like me, immerse yourself in education research, you know that North Carolina is always studied because they have a terrific student information system. But as the people there told me, they never get, it goes off to some research place and they don't see it for 3 years. They're giving out grants now, and they're requiring people to give them answers in 6 months. How is this working? How should we adjust? And they've already got some evidence on their summer learning program. They found gains, and they found gains for particular students, the most vulnerable students, and they're focused the next year on that. Connecticut is another state. They are spending $10 million in their state money on a home visiting program. It's in its 2nd year, but they're going to have data by the end of this year showing how did it work the first year, who did it work for. Early things I'm hearing is it worked well for high school students, which home visiting is usually more of an elementary school intervention. So that's the kind of way that you can use the data to make a difference, to make those continuous improvement adjustments. It also provides a proof of concept. As Emma was saying, districts are not going to be able to continue everything they started. States are not going to keep up all these things, but it's good to know what worked so you can keep it going. As I was saying, I just read about St. Paul, which has a dashboard, is developing a dashboard of, it's got something like 50 different interventions. They're going to have a dashboard that everyone can see what's working, what's not working. One of the things they did last year was put reading coaches in every elementary school, and they found that it improved reading scores. So this year they're putting even more reading coaches in elementary school. Dayton put 2 teachers in every primary grade, and a math and a English focus, reading focused teacher. They saw gains there. So they're continuing it this year, but they're trying to figure out how can they sustain it through perhaps Title I money or finding a different source of funding. So, that's an encouraging sign that when districts and states are trying initiatives and testing them out.
I love those examples, and I agree with you, Phyllis. Like, it's such a cool example to highlight for North Carolina in particular, especially this focus on the 6-month sort of cycle to sort of really challenge a shorter cycle of learning and improvement. So that's a really wonderful adjustment, and I love hearing that. Okay, so I am conscious of time, but I really want to get to this fiscal cliff conversation that I know is top of mind for a lot of folks. And so, Austin, I'd like to go to you first, just to understand from your perspective, what are you seeing and hearing about how states are thinking about and planning for the fiscal cliff? Emma, I'm coming to you after Austin, and then I would love to hear from the rest of the folks on the panel as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anu. That's such an important question. And, you know, to Phyllis's point, we're starting to see states investing a lot of their reserve funds in data collection and research and evaluation to understand what is and isn't working with all of the investments that they're making with their ESSER funds. We're starting to see some improvement. We're starting to see some evidence that these interventions are working, but it seems like what we're learning is that it's going to take beyond 2024 to get students back up to speed. And we need to figure out how to sustain some of these investments over the long term to continue to support students and close those COVID learning gaps. And which means having to think creatively, looking for other sources of funding, investing in research and evaluation so we know what works and we can make the case to sustain those initiatives. So we've been having a lot of conversations with chiefs and other state staff around sustainability discussions. I mean, this is definitely a topic that is top of mind for many of them. I'd say there are a few different approaches in how they're thinking about it. One is that we're seeing some states that are braiding their ESSER funding with other state or title dollars so that they're, you know, maybe they can't sustain those programs at the same level of funding, but they could still continue to provide some support for those programs so there's not an immediate cliff in 2024. And we've also been working with states to think about how to leverage flexibilities with federal funding to support some of these programs. So just to provide one example, a lot of districts use Title I money to support reading and math interventions, but there's still a lot more that they could do with that money. So we're starting to work with them to think about where are their flexibilities in the law, and where are there ways to kind of rethink how you've traditionally funded or used title funding to support programs and redirecting those on evidence-based programs that we see are having an impact for the students that have been most affected by the pandemic. Another approach is looking for opportunities with state funding. There are some states that have recently kind of retooled their state funding formulas that have provided some new categorical funding to support students, and that funding lasts beyond the pandemic. So I've talked to a few states. You know, one example, Colorado enacted a high impact tutoring program, I believe in 2021, and provided some state dollars to support that initiative. They're using ESSER funding right now to administer that program, but once the ESSER funding runs out, it's funded through state dollars until I believe 2026. So that's an example of how states can provide additional funding to sustain those programs. And then again, just to tie it back to research and evaluation, I think this is so important. Investing in research now and collecting the data now can help us understand in 2024 and 2025 what's working, what can we try to bring to scale and sustain long after the pandemic recovery has concluded. So there's still a lot to be determined. I think it's unrealistic to think that we can sustain the level of funding that we have gotten through ESSER, but a lot of these new programs, we will be able to hopefully deliver them to some degree in the future.
Super helpful. Thank you, Austin. And actually, I'm going to move us along because we're getting some good questions in the Q&A box. Emma, but I will just lift up some of the commentary you shared, which I think is helpful in this context to add on to Austin's commentary, which is that in addition to braiding the funding or thinking about ways to sort of innovatively use existing federal or state funding dollars, thinking about budget flexibility, you mentioned thinking about ways to manage personnel costs. more long-term, which could be done through part-time staff members or consultants or folks that you could sort of like flex up and down. And those are a couple of quick examples that you noted. I know there are many more. But let's move to Q&A for now, which are many of these questions are related to the fiscal cliff. So I'll start with the first one from Emily, which is, and I'm not sure who's best positioned to answer this. So I will ask the question and let whoever thinks they can answer jump in, which is, has the federal government considered extending the spend down timeline, given that there are unintended obstacles to districts accessing the funds? Or do you think ultimately the federal government would rather recoup the money that has not been allocated? Jump on in, David.
Or I can share too, if David doesn't.
I think the approach has to be is that, and I've heard this a lot, and I heard Austin just say it again, that we created a long-term investment with a short-term spending plan. And what we've learned is that the money's allocated. So let's be very open and realistic about time is not our friend right now. So let's begin to communicate that. Let's have conversations with policymakers to understand what you did in funding was important, helpful, and is working, but we need more time to both collect data, put into practice, and then choose the best of those things that we try to continue or that we continue to support. Just to stop, because there's an arbitrary date and a number at this point from an education standpoint would make no sense to any of us. As educators, we wouldn't, if it's working, we wouldn't stop. We would keep moving, look at research, look at data. So, I mean, I think it's a narrative, and I think we have to start the narrative right now, and it has to be a positive narrative with data to back that up.
Thanks, David. And Phyllis, why don't you jump in here with your perspective as well?
Well, I was going to talk about what the education department's done so far, what they can do, and what they might do. The way the law is written, the CARES Act has to be spent by this September, the second bill by next September, and the American Rescue Plan by September 2024. And when I say spent, obligated, committed to some sort of contract. The education department cannot change that obligation date. Congress would have to do that. So if you want to start a conversation with Congress, that would be a conversation to start. What the education department can do is extend the life of the contract. So if you make a contract in September 2024, under the current law, you could keep it going for, you'd have to spend it down in 4 months. They extended that for CARES Act money. So you'd have at least 18 months to spend it down, sometimes longer, on construction projects. And this is important. If you're redoing your HVAC, it takes a while for all these things to happen, the contracts to be let. Now, they haven't done that yet for the second two. They haven't done any extensions for the second two rounds. And they just released new guidance last week, which everybody thought would include that, but it did not. It said, we will consider this at a later date. So there's still some suspense there. But if you are having conversations with the education department or with your local congressman, that's a conversation to have.
Awesome. Thanks, Phyllis. It's helpful to hear you articulate it in that way. Until Emily jumps on, I'm going to ask maybe go through one more question. I think you are, Emily. Jump on in.
Well, so I was going to say thank you to our amazing, brilliant presenters for answering all the questions, but I do think that there's some good, like there's several questions sort of about the recovery strategies, the academic recovery strategies. And I just want to kind of summarize. So people are thinking about how are districts like kind of looking at the landscape to assess the availability of quality vendors, you know, and then what does that look like vis-a-vis like the longstanding small community-based organizations, you know, like if you have any thoughts on that. And then, you know, just digging in a little bit more about why is there not so much spending on after school and summer? And then, you know, just digging in a little bit, if you all could expand on, why don't we just take that first questions around what you know about how districts are going about identifying their, you know, the local community-based organizations to support their whatever the strategies are, whether it be the tutoring, the out of school time, the summer learning. So I don't know if maybe Marissa, you had some, you know, you've done a lot of work around this, but how are districts finding their the community organizations to work with?
Yeah, I think lots of different ways. I shared this a little bit earlier of sometimes it's a matter of organizations that there were already strong partnerships with. I think, the Department of Ed just re-upped their application process for community schools and models like that are as a part of the structure of the schools and within districts. There's, an expectation and requirement to have strong partnerships with communities. So I think that's one way. And I also would say, not to just like send back to this brief, but I think thinking about what are the evidence-based practices, and then when I think about the RFP process or the process of finding these vendors, how is my application going to include like these these guidelines? And so when I'm hiring, I'm actually, thinking about, okay, who is aligning to these best practices and who's going to actually provide a service that's going to reach the outcomes. So I think really ensuring that education leaders and the ones that are actually charged with finding these vendors are actually aware of the promising practices of the evidence-based and the research that really will back up the programming.
I'm happy to jump in as well. I mean, I think that the challenge districts have is that they're overwhelmed. And so sifting through a bunch of different NGOs, community-based organizations, for-profit providers, making sure that they have the quality, it just seems overwhelming. I think a couple of places that have managed to get around that, Baltimore did something pretty interesting where they basically seeded multiple programs. They partnered with about 10 different partners. Partly through having a chief of family engagement and their chief academic officers kind of partnering together to identify those folks. And some of those were nonprofit. They had a partnership with Johns Hopkins. They had a partnership with their local HBCU. Some of them were for-profit. They had a partnership with Amplify that managed to scale quite successfully. Some virtual tutoring. And I think to Marissa's point, they managed to actually look at each of those programs and see which were working and which weren't and which were delivering student outcomes. I think the other thing is some SEAs have come in to try and help districts in that filtering process. So Louisiana, for example, is creating a vendor list of 13 established vendors who meet certain quality criteria around tutoring that either parents can access directly or districts can access to kind of take off some of that pain, I think, of being able to filter for all of the different organizations. But that does put smaller community-based organizations at a bit of a disadvantage who may only be in one location. And so I think it's a continual challenge for districts. There's no kind of ed reports of community tutoring organizations that you could just pick the top 5. And so it's something that districts struggle to navigate.
Yeah, Emma, I'm so glad that you mentioned the state vetted vendor lists, because that's something that we've been seeing too, is that state education agencies are talking with districts and they're hearing, we don't have the capacity. There's a lot of stuff that's on our plates, especially, like David was talking about earlier, a lot of small rural districts. And so states have tried to take kind of add some capacity there, do some of the vetting and identification of quality vendors themselves and publishing those lists to make the process a little bit easier for local education leaders. Another thing that we've been seeing too is that in some cases, states have been granting funds directly to community-based organizations and nonprofits to support service delivery within their regions and communities. So, there are some states under the American Rescue Plan, they're required to set aside 2% of the overall allocation to support before and after school programs and summer enrichment programs. Some states are giving that money directly to districts to partner with community-based organizations. Some are conducting their own competitions and issuing those funds directly to providers. So that's one way that we're seeing states kind of take on that burden and use their economies of scale, so to speak, as kind of the state education agency to take on some of that work.
And I think, I know that we're going to be posting our poll for your feedback. So Sierra, if you want to go ahead and post that And we ask you, we take your responses to this poll extremely seriously, and it really helps us with our ongoing continuous improvement. So please take a minute, complete that while we keep talking. I think too, Emma, I'm gonna turn to you again, but what understanding how, Jen Reinhardt from Actual Alliance has been posting about how it's very clear there's a high demand for after school, there's a high demand for summer, and this data that you shared with like a lower amount of investment than expected. If you can kind of help us understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was a surprise to me too, because I think if you looked at Phyllis's data or at Austin's data, there was actually meaningful amounts of money dedicated to summer school and after school. And definitely we're hearing on the ground kind of more anecdotally that is ramped up. When we asked our district leaders, they did not anticipate that continuing to grow. And so it could have been that they feel like it's already at scale is one potential. Unfortunately, we didn't ask them why. So we didn't ask them, why are you allocating this much money to different categories? But given that there is some decent evidence about the effectiveness of well-run, effective summer learning programs, it really surprised us that there wasn't more appetite for that going forwards. I wish I had a better answer.
And I will say again, and I think Phyllis has some ideas here too, but that I just want to make sure everyone knows we are planning a session in January, probably the third week in January, where we are going to do a deep dive into some of these strategies that that Marissa especially addressed. We're going to look at the high impact tutoring. We're going to look at summer school and out of school time. We're going to look at, ed tech, enhanced teaching and learning. We're going to look at closing the digital divide. How districts are spending ESSER funds towards that, and what it really looks like. And we're going to have the sort of leaders of those kind of issue areas, bring them together to really dive deeper into this. But so I think Phyllis, and then Anu, if I turn it back to you to kind of last thoughts. Yeah, go ahead, Phyllis.
I was just going to say, we've been poking around at spend data in some states that have detailed, and we're seeing the same thing, especially with after school. They're not, if you compare it to the plans versus the spending, they're not as many are spending. One person I talked to said in their district, there wasn't and I'm sure there's a great demand in some places, but one person said there wasn't their demand, that parents didn't feel the need for it, that they didn't think their kids were behind. I don't know if that's true in summer learning as well. There's also a requirement that the state spend 1.2 billion collectively on summer and 1.2 billion collectively on after school. And it could be that the districts are thinking, let the state spend the money, we'll put ours someplace else. Those are no firm answer, but just some ideas.
Helpful, Phyllis. David, why don't you jump in on a last comment on this thread, and then I'll close this out.
Yeah, thank you. I think too, on the rural side of this, it's important to remember that our rural districts must use transportation to accommodate after school and summer programming. And so cost of transportation and availability and capacity to staff. So they might have the budget, they might have a plan, they might have, and many of our districts are using after school. They also use 21st century programming pretty heavily in after school programming, but you can have a great plan with great interest. And if you have nobody to drive the bus, it is really difficult for families to support that. They just don't have the ability, personal transportation, to move their kids back and forth from school after hours or in the summer.
That's totally fair. Operational challenges sort of can make all of the other challenges even more complicated. So I appreciate that, David. Well, I know we're just up on our time here. So what I'm going to ask all of you, I think if you have not taken the poll, make sure to take the poll. I think it's still live. And I just want to share a wonderful, just a deep gratitude to all of you for joining, for sharing your expertise, for sharing such useful data and incredible insights that I think will just make all of us more informed as we think about how to approach the next few years. So a huge thank you from all of us, and a huge thank you to CGLR for bringing us all together for this conversation.
And Anu, thank you so much. What brilliant moderation you just did. We really cannot thank you all enough. This was such kind of an intense conversation, but really important to see all that specific data that you have. and then had that chance to hear from all of you and really kind of unpack it. So thank you for all of your expertise. Thank you for sharing those great slides with like really clear data that will make sure everybody who's registered gets in the follow-up email. And just can't say thank you enough. And reminder, I think Sarah just posted, we have a couple of upcoming rebroadcasts that, over the sort of holidays, we'll just doing these rebroadcasts. And please keep your eye out in early January for our announcements of the session lineup that we have, including that one I keep talking about, which will be a follow-on to this session. So thank you, everybody. Have a good evening, good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.